Molly Cernik. I have a master's degree in humanities, and basically I'm going to try and summarize my master's degree for you in 45 minutes. So let's get going. This is going to be a talk about how to hopefully reinvent craft fundamentals, like fiction craft fundamentals from philosophical principles, and use those to create more immersive stories for readers. So to start with, I would like you to flex your arm, but not yet. I want you to like intend to flex your arm. I want you to like think about raising your arm or your leg, or whatever is convenient for you. So just like imagine doing that and think about what it feels like to intend to raise your arm. For me, it feels like my arm isn't just in one place, but it's all along this path that I've imagined. So like my arm is here, but it's also here, and it's here, and it's here, because I'm thinking of raising it like this. Then when you do decide to raise your arm, like what I want you to focus on is when you make the decision to raise it, as compared to like the intent to raise it. Like we've got the intent to raise it, but when are you going to decide to raise it? And then focus on like identifying the moment of that decision and then raise it. Now for me, I decide to raise my arm after I start doing it. Just a little bit after, but still afterwards. The decision happens after the movement. And then once more, like you can put your arms down, but I want you to think about raising them again, but don't. And I want you to think about like what not raising your arm feels like. Now, for me, it feels like the intent is there, but I'm stopping myself from doing it. There's like a tension in between the intent to raise and the not raising, and that tension comes from stopping myself. And so this is one exercise in a philosophical discipline that's called phenomenology. The name of it isn't important. But phenomenology itself, like this philosophy itself, is a project to try and understand average, everyday experiences that people otherwise take for granted. And if you practice enough of it, then you can start to perceive your intents. You can start to perceive the possibilities of the actions that you might take, and you can perceive the workings of your own mind. And because it is the study of the self-evident, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be very obvious in retrospect. That, this is something that you've got a lot of experience with already, and that's fine, that's expected, but we can use this kind of thing to come to some pretty interesting conclusions. And I am going to get to fiction, but I need to set the grounds of these philosophies first. One thing that I will caveat here is that I'm going to be borrowing extensively from a philosopher named Martin Heidegger. And his work has been embraced. He's like a very, very important philosopher. His work has been embraced by people of a very wide degree wide range of political opinions, including people who hate his political opinions, and you should hate Martin Heidegger's political opinions because the dude was the court philosopher for the Nazis. So trying to like separate his philosophy from the seeds of Nazism is an interesting exercise, and I've got my opinions for how to do it, and I'm only going to be presenting the portions that don't trend Nazi. So keep aware of that if you decide to read Being in Time. So the most important part of phenomenology is that consciousness starts with imagination. Imagination is the foundation of all experience, of all of our consciousness. And when I say imagination, I don't mean just like the capacity to imagine things. I mean like the activity of imagining things. And with what that activity looks like is connecting ideas to each other. And like drawing these connections of possibility. It's a very active thing. And when we do it, we're connecting things, we're connecting objects, attributes, people, stuff in our minds. And we use the drawing of those connections to imagine things we can do with the things that we have connected. And like things, objects, attributes, people, stuff, a lot of words. So the simpler name for this that I'm going to be using is entities. Entities is sort of the big word in phenomenology for nouns and verbs and all kinds of things. So pertinent visual metaphors for the imagination include things like lightning. And if you've seen slow motion footage of lightning, it starts with like the lightning reaching down from the clouds and like going out in all of these directions. It's a very exploratory thing. But then when it hits the ground, then it shoots back up. And so like there's these two connections from the sky to the earth and then back to the sky. And yet it looks very instantaneous. It looks like just this big flash of a path. And all of those flashes of paths can add up together to look like a cobweb or a thing called a rhizome. It's like a bunch of roots like this, or a network. But all of the connections that we are drawing, they form the basis of our experience, and experience is fundamentally about doing things. It's ethical in that way because it's about action, it's about judgment, and it is always going to be a very active kind of thing, because what we're doing is connecting ideas to accomplish tasks, to do projects, to realize possibilities. And one thing that this means is that the foundation of experience is doing, and then from that doing, things like being and knowing emerge. But the doing happens first in our experience. And this is a point that I want to underline, so I've got a whole other slide about it. That experience is about doing things, and that it is the first thing that we experience rather than being or knowing. So the doing itself is about caring for things, assigning importance, and realizing projects in the world. And all of that caring turns into the essence of personhood. The essence of who you are is I'm calling it the synergistic totality. Another word is Gestalt. Lisa reminded me a while ago that vibe is a good synonym. So you are the synergistic totality, you are the vibe of all the ways that you relate to the things around you and how you relate those other things to each other. And the simpler version is that you are what you care about and you are how you care about those things. So then, like, what do we care about? Like all of these entities in the world, they're basically the same kind of thing as each other in terms of how the consciousness works. Everything from a television to the color blue to the rising cost of housing to my spouse, all of these are entities, and we can connect all of them to each other to accomplish a task. And these entities are meaningful to the degree that they can affect the ways that we behave, the kinds of choices that we make, the kinds of projects that we undertake. And so having meaning means being able to be used to change the world, from very small degrees of changing the world to like large, like scale doesn't really matter for purpose of this. Like even just lifting my cup is changing the world, which, time for some water. And the knowledge around the world is always like instrumental. It's knowledge about how to do something. The ability to relate an aspect of an entity to another aspect of an entity, maybe two aspects of the same entity, is always about accomplishing a task that's possible. And even something very simple like knowing how somebody's hair looks means knowing how to look at their hair. This is the kind of like very small scale meaning, very small scale task accomplishment, but it's still the same basic kind of task as standing up to get across the room. And I've got another image here of a network. This one is very computerized. But the kinds of connections that are being shown in this image are the kinds of connections that make up our world. The world that we live in, the imagination projects out to create these kinds of relationships and connections. And the connections that we draw in the world change based on how we live in it. The kinds of choices that we make, the kinds of tasks that we have already done, the kinds of things that we like, all of those change the nature of the world itself, because the world is our projected imagination, is the projected connections that we draw. I think, did I hear the start of the question?
Someone says that they are just seeing the first slide, and then other people are saying that they do see the slides change. So maybe, I think everything is okay.
These slides are going to be made available after the presentation, I believe. I hope that, or at least when I asked, they said yes. However, if there's a visual or something that I'm talking about, maybe I can work better on describing the visual as it comes up. Would that be a workable solution for now?
I think that sounds good. I'm just waiting for Dawn to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Dawn can hear fine, so can still get the ideas. Okay. If it's too much to describe the visuals, it's okay.
Okay. Okay. So the current visual is a bunch of words that are in differently colored circles being connected to each other with small gray lines. The organization of like all of the words that are in the image is sort of in an oval, and some of the lines are weighted differently to indicate stronger connections. So the world that we see is, or perceive, changes with our moods. It promotes certain kinds of moods based on the connections that are easiest to create, which is sort of a combination of our histories, like the kinds of connections that we have made in the past, and also the sort of ambient meaning of the entities that we encounter. Some of them are just more prone to certain kinds of connections, like a knife feels differently if it's a butter knife or a, I don't know, stabbing knife. Those connections are easier to make with one as opposed to the other. But when an entity is being used to accomplish a task, sometimes it can break. And these broken entities call to mind the things that they should be able to do. The function that is missing sort of becomes more present in mind. And that the presence of that missing function interrupts whatever it is that we were trying to do with a new task to somehow recreate that missing capability, usually by fixing or replacing whatever broke. And I'll give an example of this. Like, I had a keyboard years ago where the D key stopped working. And so what I did was I pried the key off, and I was like casting around for like, how can I figure out what's going on here? I like inspected it, and I found out that somehow one of my eyelash hairs had gotten in between the contact points on the key itself. And so I was like, okay, how can I get that out? I went and I got a knife from the kitchen to like try and do some surgery and then pull the eyelash out, and it didn't work. And so like when I put the key back together, it still wasn't quite working, except that this time, sometimes it would just create an infinite string of D characters. And so I knew how to interrupt this, and I could like delete the extra Ds that were being created. But one thing that I started to do was I left a tab open in my internet browser with the letter D in capital and lowercase in the URL, so that I could copy which one that I wanted and paste it into whatever I was working on. Yeah, and so like sometimes you have to go really, really out of your way in order to replicate this function, but like it's I hope that's a useful illustration of like what brokenness kind of like forces you to think about. And so the next part of all of these projects that we are undertaking is how we experience time, and the connections that we are drawing, they're always meant to accomplish something. And so because of that ideal state of what we are trying to accomplish, experientially the future comes before the past does, because we create the future as an imagined state based on the consequences of the projects that we're undertaking, the consequences of the projects that we perceive around us. And after we create the future, we create the past, because the past is an imagined world that would have the present as its consequence. And so what we do is we like create the future with certain kinds of causality, and then we learn to sort of operate that causality in backwards, and use the backwards causality to reconstruct what the past must have been like. And this is a little bit different from the discipline of history. The discipline of history has ways to control for like imagination, but it's the same basic kind of thing. And I have just remembered, I have a graphic on the screen that is the sort of two cones being stacked on top of each other with point to point. And the top cone is the future, the bottom cone is the past, and the very middle there is a line indicating the present. And that present is caught between the future and the past, and I'm not describing the image anymore. The present is caught in between the future and the past, and the way that we experience the present is the feeling of being thrown through time. Because it's sort of always fleeting, and we can sort of begin to sense that. And to try and sense it, I've got another little activity for us to try and identify the moment of now. So what I would like you to do is to like imagine the like time flowing through you and anticipate when now is going to happen, and then tap your finger or say now to yourself or anything else that feels right to try and mark when now happens, and see how that works. I can't do it. I am always just a little bit too early or a little bit too late. But trying to do it, trying to do that repeatedly, I can start to feel myself moving in a direction that I can't go. And that is the feeling of the present. That's how I experience it, is that feeling of having been thrown through time, like being in the air. And so, like, talking about all of these projects and stuff, the way that the nature of experience, imagination always comes first in our experiences. It comes before perception. It's not the other way around. Many of us have learned to make perception the first thing that we experience, but that is something that we had to learn. Part of the magic of being a child that most people agree is lost through maturity, is that we have to learn to use our senses. And that's a process that takes years. It takes our whole lives. And people can, like, if you're a professional nose for a perfumer, then you can learn to, like, really, really dive into your senses in specific ways. But it is a learned process. Imagination is not. Imagination is an innate thing from birth. And again, you can, well, I guess, thinking of exceptions to my own rules here, you can learn to make more creative connections. You can learn to widen the field of entities that you would be connecting with your imagination. But that activity is sort of fundamental to consciousness in a way that perception is ancillary. And consciousness among children is much more self-referential. It's less disciplined, it's freer. And even as adults, like, sometimes we can withdraw from our perceptions to daydream. But that is basically letting the imagination do its work unimpeded by perception. And I have an image here of a gracile black man whose body is made of flowers, and the only parts that are sort of recognizably human are his hands and his head. And so what I mean to accomplish with this image is to say that the imagination is also a very bodily thing. We think with our entire bodies, not just with our brains. But moving on, adults have learned to make perception the primary mode of imagination. So that is sort of the trick that we play on ourselves, is we think that the perception comes first when it doesn't have to. And building from this, I want to say that thought and emotion are very, very much the same thing, because both of them, although we experience them slightly differently, both of them are the imagination drawing logical connections between entities in the world and then presenting the findings of those connections to ourselves. And one of the ways that that works is that emotions have very logical structures to them. And I'm going to use fear as an example here because I primarily edit horror. And also because Martin Heidegger spells out the structure of fear very explicitly in Being and Time. But it's both of those things, not just the one. So we experience fear when some entity approaches that may or may not negatively involve itself with something that we care about. All three of those elements have to be in place for us to experience fear. And by threatening what matters to us, it also threatens us. Because remember, like, we are the things that we care about. We are the ways that we care about things. And so what happens during the fear is it brings to mind our relationship to and our involvement with the entity that matters to us. Literally, it brings our cares to mind when something is happening on, like in a movie, that is fearsome, then we think like, oh no, that character is somebody that I care about, but it's that relationship that we are focusing on when we are experiencing fear. And it's not a simple thing. Like, we don't ever just experience fear. We always experience many emotions at the same time, although fear can become dominant. And our relationships and our involvements in the world can create these textures for any emotional encounter. Like our history, we bring our history into our emotional encounters. And the nature, like the essences of the objects that are around us, also add textures to the emotional encounters. So it's very nuanced, it's very deep. It's never just as simple as like, I am afraid. It's always like, I am afraid, and also there are these other like particularities of the experience of fear. So on what some would say the other side is the math and the hard sciences. There's a specific kind of world that math and hard sciences attempt to describe. And most of the time, we can't really perceive the kinds of existence that math and hard sciences attempt to describe, because what we perceive is our projected imagination. And so like any kind of like meaningless fact of existence, like just this thing is here, we don't really perceive that because we connect it to all kinds of meanings, we connect it to all kinds of histories, we connect it to all kinds of senses. However, that doesn't mean that we're isolated from the world of math and hard sciences, because sometimes things that happen in the like abstracted worlds can be things that we perceive, and those things that we perceive can be like very opposite to our normal way of living. For example, if I am just a domestic example, if I'm in the kitchen and all of a sudden like my cabinets give out and there's this big crash as whatever was on the cabinet shelf like falls and makes this very large sound, what I experience is shock. And like it is this other world that's sort of intruding into my imagination, intruding into my consciousness. And I've got a book on screen now by Eugene Thacker. The title of the book is In the Dust of This Planet. You may have heard of it. It was a big deal in horror spheres a few years ago. But Eugene Thacker and Martin Heidegger are kind of unified on this division between worlds. So we've got the projected world of imagination, our average everyday experiences. And in the Eugene Thacker, in Martin Heidegger, we call this the world with a capital W. I'm going to keep using this world, like anytime that you see world with capital W for the rest of the presentation, I'm talking about the projected world of imagination. Then there's also the earth, which is indifferent, it's thoughtless, it's meaningless. The entities within the earth are not connected to each other. And both of these sort of exist in the same place, but they are kind of not experienced in the same way. And then there's also like a border in between experience and non-experience. And Eugene Thacker calls that the planet. And his metaphor for that is like the crevices deep within the earth. They're kind of thinkable, you can imagine them, but they also kind of exist on their own. And on the subject of thinkability, there are limits to our perception, there are limits to our imagination. And so the world with a capital W is a bounded thing. Within the world, everything connects to everything else through the act of care, through these possibilities that we are drawing, through these connections that we are making, and the importance that we assign to all of those things. So when we are existing in the world, capital W, we are creating, we are revealing, we are activating possibilities, meanings, projects. Like that's the imagination. And I've alluded to this a few times already, but the essences of entities are the concentrations of meaning and possibility that are kind of embedded into them. Think again of the butter knife or the stabbing knife. Like they have very different essences because of the meaning, because of the possibility that is present in them. Have some more water. So another way of saying that is that essence is condensed doing, because all of these things are experienced in the context of things that we can do. And so being, like the act of being, the essence of being, is the condensation of all the things that we can do. But this also means that there are limits to thought, limits to imagination. If something can be thought, if it is thinkable, that means that it can be connected into these networks that we create of care. And the degree to which it is thinkable, the degree to which it is able to be understood, is the degree to which it is enmeshed in those networks. Anything that can't be connected to those networks is unthinkable, literally unthinkable. We cannot think it. That doesn't mean that we can't experience it. And if an unthinkable thing happens to us and insists on itself, it retains its presence in our mind, but still can't be connected to the average everyday world, that's one thing, that's one way to understand what trauma is. So that is it for phenomenology. I understand it as the inside-out approach to feeling. This is like a really big discipline of philosophy, so like I hope that I'm doing it any amount of justice. But I'm calling it the inside-out approach to feeling because it is like about the internal structures of feeling that we then project out into the world, like our side of any encounter. So I think I'll pause for 30 seconds here. Is there anything that anybody would like me to talk about more or expand on, or questions or anything like that?
I think it's going great. I am enjoying. I think people are just like captivated. That is what is happening.
I hope so. All right. So in the absence of any questions, then I'm going to keep moving. If there's anything that comes up, I am hoping that I'm going to have time at the end of all this. I believe that mine is the last presentation in the room for the day, so we can absolutely hang out and talk about this more as you like. But moving on for now, the outside-in approach to feeling, that is the way that I understand the field of affect theory. This is a completely different discipline. And why it's outside in is that their meaning doesn't just rest within us. Like the objects have meaning, entities have meaning, and we feel that meaning and it affects us. And that affect, like that effect, also creates emotions. It also creates feelings. And I believe that that is why it's that's one of the ways that I understand why it's affect theory rather than the study of external emotions or whatever.
Could I interject with a question?
Mm-hmm.
Kath says, I might be jumping ahead, but do you connect that visual first assumption to how some authors tend to take a head movie approach to writing, and why that might fall flat? Question mark.
I do talk about that later on. Yes, basically, yes, that we actually, I kind of blame, was it Descartes for that? The guy who said, I think, therefore I am. Because one of the things that he did with the phrase, I think, therefore I am, he was trying to create a statement that he could not doubt. And he was like, metaphorically, he was extremely violent in trying to create this statement that he can't doubt. Is it possible at all to doubt that I am where I say I am? Sometimes people have hallucinations, so yes, I can doubt that. And therefore it is not true that I am where I am. Is it possible for me to not be the person that I think I am? Yes, there are people who are very convinced that they are the reincarnation of Napoleon Bonaparte. So it is possible for me to doubt who I think I am, therefore it's not true. Is it possible for me to doubt that I am the person who is doubting? No, this is not something that I can doubt. I think, therefore I am. And so like, by like tearing away the world that he lived in, he concentrated all of experience just in the mental faculties that he had. And so from that, we have the mind-body divide. From that, we have tons and tons of like things denying the importance of the body. Like, this is a very cultural thing. And by denying the necessity of the body and by focusing so extremely on the activity of the mind, then we have started to think of ourselves as mechs, basically, like flesh mechs. Where there is an us that is inside of our body rather than being integrated with it. And one of the cultural outputs of that is the feeling in so many people's writing that it's only the internal sensor that is real, and so the body turns into a conveyance device for thinkers to get around. That's where I think that comes from.
I think you're good to continue.
Okay.
Oh, Kat says thank you.
You're welcome. So within affect theory, there are two kinds of emotional experiences that are very important to understand. The first is a shared emotional experience, and the second is an individual emotional experience, a social experience and a psychic experience. Now, the shared experience, one example of that is the shared aesthetic experience of being, in a crowd at a good concert. And then, like, within that experience, there is like this sensory entity, the music, that is sort of captivating us and like sort of taking over the imagination that are projecting out into the world. It's getting passed around, and we're all feeling something about that music, and it can be a very unifying thing. However, if the singer then says something racist and you're the only person nearby who doesn't like it, then that disrupts the shared experience. It turns it into an individual experience for you, and like, you start to wonder about like the crowd that you are in. You start to wonder about the band's singer. And both of these kinds of experiences are going to be affected by your personal and shared histories. Being thrown off by a racist lyric when that racist lyric is targeting somebody who's like you is a very different experience than then also being thrown off by that racist lyric, but because you know it's wrong, rather than having that kind of direct experience. So there's like a personal history, there's a shared history there, and even if we have a very structurally similar experience, 2 different times, the added history of our lives in between those 2 experiences is going to make it feel differently because of that added life context, because we have more history that we're bringing to it. And the ways that all of these experiences get passed around people in social settings, the most important book that I personally feel has been written in the field of affect theory is The Cultural Politics of Emotion by Sarah Ahmed. I chose this particular cover because I liked the color balance. You'll notice that it's second edition instead of second edition. I liked the colors. So the ways that these emotions flow in between people, it's going to be different within a person, it's going to be different across people. And so I'm just going to quote from this book. Given that shared feelings are not about feeling the same feeling or about feeling in common, it's the objects of emotion that circulate rather than emotion itself as such. So these objects become sticky, they become saturated with affect as sites of personal and social tension. The simpler version of this is that history gets baked into entities, and that history has an emotional valence. When one of these entities circulates in a social setting, we don't necessarily feel that exact emotional valence, but we feel something about it. And so like our emotions are going to be different because of our histories and because of these social dynamics, because of like sociology, social justice, all that kind of thing. But we are probably all reacting to the same thing, or at least the same valence. And this is always a very simultaneous thing. I've got a graph on the screen. It is 2 circles with arrows sort of reaching toward each other. And what I'm hoping that this graph experiences is the simultaneity of these emotions getting shared and flowing around. So these emotion-laden entities, they flow between people in a social setting, and they affect us before we reflect on how they affect us. Our reflections on that affect, on the effect on the affect, becomes a new entity that we can then also reflect on. But the flow of all of these entities amongst people is called the affective flow. And affect itself is our encounter with that affective flow. So we are like in a stream, and the stream itself is the affective flow, and affect is our presence in that stream. So I really want to emphasize that this whole thing happens all at once. It's ongoing. It's simultaneous. It is not a sequence of events. It's all at once. And so most works of affect theory study very specific examples of these flows, of these encounters, and it's very granular. There's a really good essay that is, I'm going to link to, or is present in a book that I recommend at the very end. The essay is about exploring all the different kinds of emotional valences that go into how a disabled combat veteran might feel about their prostheses. That's fascinating stuff. Lots and lots of different kinds of social dynamics go into this, and so it becomes like this really emotional object. It's really cool stuff. So also within affective flow are other people's emotions, because emotions themselves are emotion-laden entities. We sense the things that people around us feel. as said before, we don't necessarily respond in the same way. We don't necessarily all feel the same thing at the same time, but we do react to each other's feelings. And again, if you practice, if you focus on affect theory enough, if you work with it enough, you can start to actually perceive it. Like when I was deep in my master's degree, I could see people's emotions flowing in between each other's. Breathtaking. And if you do this, of course, you will start to receive even more praise for your attentiveness to the people around you, because you are literally attending to the ways that they feel. That's where your attention is going. So finally, how does this help us with fiction? So going back to phenomenology, we are what we care about. We are that nexus, that node in this network of care. And so by caring about a character in a story, we care about the things that they care about, and what's important to them becomes important to us. We don't necessarily feel the same way about it as they do. In fact, there can be some really interesting narrative effects that are created with intentional dissonance. But we are still the investment in a character becomes a vehicle for importance to be conveyed. And so for characters to feel real, they have to care about things that are important. And other characters have to, and all characters have to care about each other in important ways. So you're creating these networks between people, between characters, and you're creating this system of importance within the story. And so for that realness to be created in a story, you have to have that network. It's all about the context. And one reason that I'm presenting it like this is we can't just save the cat. If you know that reference. The idea of saving the cat is creating a likable element about a character, and likability is irrelevant to being invested in the character. If you show the character as a node in this network of relations and importance, then that is what creates reader investment. And so you got to lead with the context. You have to create these networks of care, of comfort, of meaning, of utility in the story. And that context is going to replicate the feeling of caring that we experience in the world. And so by creating that network, by creating that context in the story, we can make readers care more. And that system of importance, if we also show how each element of the story, how each entity in the story matters and how it affects each other element, then we can make the books feel more cohesive. We can, and that also extends to characterization. If we increase a character's sensorium, how their their perceptions on the page, not everybody's going to be noticing the same things. You can increase the sense of the character being a real person by making a point of showing the ways that they notice the world, the ways that they move through it. And along with that, because the world is our projection of our imagination, it's really, really, really good fiction craft to intentionally use the pathetic fallacy. And if you're not familiar with the phrase, the pathetic fallacy, it is the idea that when somebody is gloomy, then the world is gloomy, that the world reflects the mood that we have. If somebody is feeling in turmoil, then it's a dark and stormy night. Use that. When people are in a mood, the existence doesn't actually work like this, the entities around us don't react to our moods, but we experience them as though they do. And so if you use the pathetic fallacy in fiction, then it's going to make your character feel more present. Along with this, you can use the structure, like the logical structures of emotion in the story, and turn the structure of emotion into plot beats. So by putting the sequence of, putting these structures of emotions into the sequence of the story, it's going to help the readers to feel things alongside the characters. Again, I'm a horror editor, so I'm focusing a lot on structures of fear, shock, disgust, pain, hate, shame, love, trauma, like all of these, sadness, you name it. A lot of these negative emotions very relevant to horror. But for now, I'm just going to focus on like replicating fear on the page. So the three elements of fear: the fearsome element, or the fearsome entity, the threatened entity, and the care that the fearer feels, the person who is afraid feels. So to have a story do fear-making, the fear-making needs to happen in the story before the fear itself happens. So if you establish this network of care, if you establish the nature of what is being threatened, and like how the fearer cares about the thing that's being threatened, and then you establish the nature of the threat, then the reader should perceive those relationships and make their own fear, because because of the structure of emotion, because of the nature of care, and again, the structure of emotion. Like, by putting those structures into the narrative, you create them in the reader. So in addition to these like internal things, we also need to understand the work of meaning that the story is going to do in the world once it gets published. How do these emotions get used in the world? Where else do we see the patterns and the arrangements in the book in the world? Like, how does the book reflect what's happening in day-to-day consensus reality? Those are things that we need to be able to understand how the book is likely to be received. We also need to be able to understand them to flag them for a possible sensitivity read. Sometimes we're not the reader for that, but we might be able to at least identify the kinds of sensitivity reading that needs to get done. Also, back to phenomenology, the inside-out thing. Growth as a character comes from meaning. It comes from the capacity to affect the world. So each time that a character does something, it contributes to their skills, it contributes to their histories, and it makes that kind of choice potentially more likely, but not necessarily. The meaning that a character garners from each choice, or from the recontextualization of previous choices, like if suddenly something about the story reveals something that they hadn't known or hadn't thought about before, the meaning that they garner from that is their growth arc. And it's replicated it's present at the scene level, and then when you add all of those scene level meanings together, that is their book level or story level growth arc. And so when you are working on that growth arc, you can also place elements from the growth arc into the story to reflect the character's choices in the world. And the meaning that they derive from those choices can also be present in the world of the book. And when you do that, it increases the sense of thematic resonance. It increases the cohesion between the character and the plot. On the small scale, you can also do this with dialogue, because each speech act in a dialogue exchange is a new choice for each character to make. And so each conversation should change at least one of the participants, even if only by entrenching them in their existing views. Because like the dialogue sort of becomes its own story, and should have its own arc. Another kind of growth is intimacy, and this is especially relevant to romance genres, but intimacy is much larger than just romance, of course. The more that we care about somebody, and because we are what we care about, the more their cares become our cares, the more we incorporate their personhood into our own personhood. Ideally, like if it's a balanced thing, then also the more that our personhood gets incorporated into theirs, the more that our cares become their cares. And the way to do this is by involving ourselves into other people's projects, involving the main character into their romantic interest projects, or their friends' projects. By doing things together, people sort of intertwine in their cares, and that intertwining is the growth of intimacy. It's a skill. It is a doing. It is a way of doing. And so the often true intimacy, when like your cares are like become very fully intertwined with another person's or another character's cares, it's a threat to our sense of independence and self-determination. And it's a very reasonable threat, because intimacy does change us. It changes who we are. Because like our personhood gets enmeshed with another personhood. And so the fear that creates, sometimes people will pull away from the intimacy to reassert their independence, reassert their self-determination. And sometimes, but not always, that is followed by a return to the intimate relationship, to the mingling and the alignment of cares. And I've got a short list here of other kinds of intimacy. There's romantic, there's sexual, of course. There's also friendly, there's also familial, mentoring, collaborative, competitive, even hostile. If you've read a lot of fanfic, then you definitely know that like people can be very, very concerned with the thoughts and with the actions of people that they freaking hate. That's a kind of intimacy. And there are other kinds of intimacies too. This is just a short list that I created. So by understanding this intimacy growth arc, we can better develop it on the page by making it related to choices rather than just sort of indicating that these people are intimate. And also focus on like the doing aspect of intimacy. So this also has relevance to world building. We've talked a lot about the phenomenological world, and so of course we're going to talk about world building. Because doing is the basis of experience, we can use doing to streamline the world building that we need to do. If you present how the world works in the context of choices that people make, this is very efficient. You can link these choices and thus the plot with the world building itself. Doing so also keeps the narrative moving. It makes the tasks also more interesting to the reader, because you are doing more things at once. You're progressing the plot, you're also expanding the world. And thus because there's more things that something is doing, then it is more interesting, it's more engaging for the reader to encounter. Also, many readers can extrapolate to a wide degree, from even minor details. So heavy exposition, info dumping is often unnecessary. And the way that I think is best to solve that kind of drafting technique, it's not a bad drafting technique, but during revision, you can cut a lot of it back and just link as much world building as possible to the choices that people are making. And also by focusing on context and doing stuff, we help to address the experience of being a person in a mech, like an observer in a mech. Focusing on context, focusing on doing stuff helps us to focus on our bodies, on the limitations of our bodies, the exchanges between bodies, the actions that we take in the world. And doing that helps us to just more naturally write physical beats onto the page, because what are we doing things with if not our body? Also, going back to affect theory, the focus on doing stuff helps to inform how people are going to act around each other. what it's like to be in the presence of a character, what it's like to be in the presence of an established relationship, and how you would act around that. It's again ethical. It's about doing things, and doing all of. I'm almost done here. Doing all of these things helps increase the sense of realism in the emotional and social spheres. Realism, of course, is a narrative technique. It's not necessarily like an actual reflection of how the world works, because the world doesn't just work in one way. It works as the projection of our imaginations. But people often have a very finely tuned sense for how emotions work, for how sociality works, and the focus on the ethics, the focus on the doing of things, helps increase the sense that people are feeling real things, that they are acting in real ways. And that, of course, also helps with reader immersion. And so I think that is everything that I've got. I hope that I am under time. I think I'm 15 minutes over, aren't I? Oh boy. So this is the time to bring forward any questions. You can contact me on Discord if this is not the right place. I've also got my further readings here. So thank you for your attendance, and we can go into the larger chat.
Also, Molly, if you haven't already, you can submit your slides to Ellis, and then they will be available for people to look at.
I have already done that. They will be available.
I feel like my brain is trying to catch up with all of the growing it just did.
I hope in positive ways.
Yes. Yes, certainly.
Mm-hmm. You'll also notice that I am brazen enough here to provide recommended readings that I have written. Please forgive me, but I really do believe in my interpretations of these disciplines.
I think that's a good sign.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Cass says, I think this is a ball of yarn that will be fun to unravel and tease out. There's a lot that can be extrapolated from it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Good.
It's a pretty darn good compliment.
Thank you. So yeah, also when the slides are available, then these should all be functional links, so you can start to read things out on your own as you like. Or we can chat about them, because I love talking about this stuff. I don't have a dissertation. I just got to my master's degree, but I can put the link to my master's thesis into chat here. Boom. It's not a full copy of my master's thesis, because that gets into like some really niche stuff, but it is like all of the theory that I draw on, and like the broader, like generalizable kinds of studies. course. I hope that this has been interesting. I hope that it's compelling, and I hope most of all that it helps us all to write and edit better stories.
I think so. Are we good with questions?
So, thank you again, everybody, for spending this time with me. I hope this has been useful, and it's been a pleasure to info dump to all of you about one of my special interests.
Thanks for doing the recording, Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.